I get dropped off in Antarctica. It's 2018. I'm attempting to be the world's first person in history to cross the entire continent of Antarctica, the landmass, solo, unsupported, which means no resupplies of food or fuel, and unaided. So no kites, no dogs, no nothing else that's going to propel me. Just me, mano y mano, trying to cross the frozen continent. The plane drops me off. So I'm alone in Antarctica, and I try to pull my sled, and I straight up can't pull it. Like, I can move it like 10 feet. And I break down and I start crying, and I actually called my wife. The tears are freezing to my face. I'm like, what do I do? And she says to me,
my guest today holds the world record for climbing the highest peak on every continent faster than anybody else ever. He also was the first human to cross Antarctica on foot, unaided, unsupported. That means that alone, for 54 days, he traveled 932 miles while pulling a 375-pound sled behind him. Colin O'Brady holds 10 world records. And amongst other things, some major things you're going to get from this episode. First and foremost, unbelievable stories. I will be shocked if you don't listen to this or watch this all the way through without stopping. Unbelievably engaging. Number two, really tactical mindset tricks that will allow you to get through anything in your life, business or otherwise. And number three, you're going to hear the sales strategy that Colin used to convince the CEO of Nike to fund one of his adventures. I love Colin O'Brady. He is a good friend and perpetually engaging and entertaining to talk to. I hope you like this as much as I enjoyed recording it. Without further ado, Colin O'Brady.
Colin O'Brady, welcome to Austin, man. It's great to see you.
great to be here with you, my friend. Always a pleasure.
Yeah, it's I anticipated doing this remotely at some point in time, and I was pleasantly surprised 2 days ago to find out that you were in town and we could just squeeze it in.
I know, it's perfect. It's always best to do it in person. Always great to see you. So here we are.
Yeah, and the good and bad points to this are that you are here because you had an expedition cut short with a near-death experience.
Yep.
So I want to get back to that part of it. But for those that have not met you, don't know about you, you were a professional triathlete. You hold 10 world records or have broken 10 world records. The Explorers Grand Slam speed record, which is the highest peak on every continent, plus each of the poles, faster than anybody else in the world.
Yep.
Crossed Antarctica alone, pulling your own shit, a 350-pound plus sled behind you for 54 days. First human ever to do that, amongst a litany of other things. So I want to get into a bunch of that shit. But first and foremost, before we talk background, what of those adventures or which of your adventures has been the most impactful for you?
Yeah, I mean, it's each adventure has certainly had its own experiences, lessons learned. And I know we're going to be talking a lot about business and entrepreneurship. A lot of it's been like, hey, I want to go to the North Pole, South Pole. I want to go to summit of Everest. Like, shit, I don't have any money. Like, how do I build a brand? How do I create around that to actually, go live that and have impact at scale? And we'll talk a lot about that. But I think on a personal level, the solo crossing of Antarctica in 2018, I think for a number of reasons was probably the most impactful. One, spending 54 days alone in an empty white abyss. If you don't come out of that somehow changed, then there's probably something wrong with you. So that was a deep cut, personally on an internal journey. And that also coincided with that expedition, and a lot of the work that I had done leading up to it, ended up having a massive effect, in the press and the media. I became the first person in history to complete that crossing, something that people had tried for, 100 years unsuccessfully. And as a result of that, sort of a perfect storm of press and media and brand and where we positioned the story and things like that, it ended up being, viewed by over 2 billion people in terms of media impressions, which was the most widely viewed expedition in modern history. And so as a result of that, there was a sort of net multiplier effect on a lot of hard work that I put in as a professional athlete, sort of leading to not just my ability to successfully complete that. I feel like I had to pull on every tool that I'd learned as a professional athlete basically for my whole life, but also from a business sense, it was this force multiplier and really opening a lot of doors in an exponential way. But it's kind of the classic, we all hear this in entrepreneurship, an overnight success, 10 years in the making.
Sure.
It's definitely that same type of feeling, which it was a huge moment in my life and it continues to have a ripple effect. But it was built on the back of, a lot of hard work that, went to finally get to that, really apex moment.
Yeah. And I want to talk about a bunch of those things because there's so much to unpack with both the endurance side of it, the adventure and expedition side of it, the entrepreneurship side of it. One of the things that you just highlighted that I think is really relevant for people to grasp is there was sort of an era of humanity where we were exploring parts of the world that had never been touched. And a lot of the time with no fucking resources.
Mm-hmm.
The initial attempts to cross Antarctica were wool and, dogs with you and eating fat to survive and crazy shit. And we're in a different space where it's almost impossible to find things that haven't been done, but even more so to get attention for them, right? People don't pay attention to those things the same way. So I want to get into that, but before we do, I want to talk a little bit about how you started. So what got you into endurance in the first place? Because you started as a triathlete. That was the beginning of the endurance stuff, right?
It actually goes back a little bit further than that. I mean, it goes back to early childhood. When I was 5 years old, I was running around outside this pool deck and there happened to be swim lessons, but also a swim meet happening. And my mom, I was a rambunctious kid with a ton of energy. My mom was literally looking for the sport that she could put me in. A, that didn't cost very much. We didn't have a lot of money as a kid, but B, that would just use up as much energy as possible. And loved team sports and actually played soccer at a high level, but baseball, you're kind of standing around a lot or, things like that. She's like, swimming, wait, you're just exercising the whole time? This must burn the maximum amount of calories.
Love it.
So she put me into a swim race. I won that first little, 5 and under little kids swim race, and ended up swimming all the way through college. So I was a nationally ranked swimmer in high school. I was a Division I collegiate swimmer at Yale, which then, of course, as you mentioned, sort of led into triathlon. The early days were really around swimming, but a big shift in my life that I know that you have heard the story before, but really happened after college and before triathlon, which was I decided after college to travel around the world for a year. I didn't have very much money. I saved up painting houses. That was my first entrepreneurship venture, was 15-year-old kid painting houses. And I kept that summer job through high school and college, saving up a few $1,000 going, man, when I graduate from college, I'm going to go travel around the world.
What company was that?
It was just a company that me and my childhood buddy started called Precision Painting.
Oh, nice. So it's just you guys doing it.
Yeah. So we spent 1 year doing what was called College Pro or something like that painting, where it's basically high school and college kids painting houses.
Yeah.
And we did that for one summer working for somebody else. Then we looked at each other and we're like, the barrier to entry for doing this ourselves is not high.
I love
Let's
that.
buy a paint sprayer. Let's buy a couple ladders and things like that and just do it ourselves and not have to give them the cut. And it worked out for us because his dad was a contractor. So that gave us a little bit of our first pipeline to be able to get a couple jobs. But then after that, when we were 16, 17, 18, we were able to we had enough hey, we've painted these houses in your neighborhood. Do you want to, I think we were pretty good at it for our, for our age and experience level. But
yeah, that's awesome. A very good friend of mine, who's also been on the show, Cameron Harold, was running College Pro Painters for years.
Nice.
And that as a business model is fascinating because it's a summer job, right?
Totally.
So they build up this monster workforce across the continent.
Oh, yeah.
And then they all leave.
Yeah, it's crazy.
And some of them leave and do what you did, which is I'll just take the model. I can do this myself. Which is the most entrepreneurial of them, right? It's sort of franchise versus doing it yourself.
Correct. Yeah, no, I mean, it was a great way to cut our teeth. And then also it was a great way as it was the classic, you're a high school, college kid, okay, I get a summer job working, the grocery store or do, this internship or whatever. And it was wait, we can do this. And for us, it was wait, we can paint houses and make, $3 $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 ourselves, not like, hourly, and then go do whatever we want, manage our own time. We're like, this working for ourselves thing is pretty great. Even though it's hard work, right? It just felt better for us. It definitely was like, that was pretty obvious to me as a young person that like I wanted my life to end up somehow directionally there. But yeah, so after college, I took backpack, a surfboard, and the few $1,000s I'd saved up and went and traveled around the world. My hope was to travel for a year. Barely any money, shoestring budget, sleeping on youth hostels and hitchhiking around and trying to, save a little money to have some beers at night so I could have some fun. But like, it was like on the cheap. It was an amazing experience. And then I was in Thailand actually, and I ended up getting severely burned in a fire. So I was foolishly jumping a flaming jump rope, of all things. Wrapped that rope around my legs, lit my body on fire completely to my neck. Ended up jumping in the ocean, which saved my life, but not before about 25% of my body was severely burned, predominantly my legs and feet. And no proper hospital. I was on this tiny little island. There was a cat running around my chest and, across my bed in this ICU. And I, was in a bad state. But worst of all, being an athlete, to your question about, endurance, was the doctor walks in after a couple of days and looks me in the eye and said, "Hey man, like, I hate to tell you this, but you're so badly burned around your ankles, your knees, your ligaments. We don't think that you'll probably ever regain full mobility. You'll probably never be able to walk normally again." And it was just obviously to that, obviously there's a lot of pain. It was horrible, but like, there's nothing like being in your body as a person and body, like that's sort of like my identity in the world. I haven't been a, Division I athlete right before that. And it's all of a sudden like, boom, you made one stupid mistake, kid. And like, that's all over. And so that was a incredibly dark period of my life. I just remember that sinking feeling inside of myself. But fortunately, my mother, she arrived over to the Thai hospital. She sat with me for weeks and weeks in that Thai hospital and really wrapped me in this sort of air of positivity of saying, "Hey, yeah, you screwed up. We're not going to sugarcoat this. You're lying here with your legs bandaged and in a wheelchair, but what do you want to do when you get out of here? Like, let's set a goal." And, I think that actually does tie back to sort of those initial phases of entrepreneurship, or even in the middle of it where like shit's going to go wrong. Like, and you're going to make mistakes. Like I made a massive mistake here. And my set point at that, as a young person was like, man, I screwed up, just downward spiral of negativity. And thankfully my mother came back to me and was like, "Sure. Yep. This is a tough spot, but let's learn from it. Let's grow from it. Like, where can we go from here?" And the difference between those two things is really the difference, in my life. I wouldn't be sitting here having this conversation with you at 10 world records otherwise. But, long story short, she's like, "If you could do anything when you get out of here, what would you do?" And I was like, close my eyes, kind of visualize. And I saw myself in my own visualization crossing a finish line of a triathlon, which is not something I'd ever done before. I was a swimmer, of course, but I never biked or run competitively. But for whatever reason, that vision was what I upheld as like me being back in my body, able-bodied, strong, et cetera, again. And so instead of her saying, "Yeah, that's a ridiculous goal, don't go for it," which again, as entrepreneurs, we've probably heard sometimes from our close community of friends, like, "Hey, dream smaller, get a real job." Like, that what if that doesn't work out? Like that's unfortunately the limiting beliefs in our pervasive culture really box people in. Mm-hmm. And I applaud anyone who's listening to this, who's an entrepreneur, who's fighting against not only their own interior dialogue, but the dialogue of, colleagues, parents, relatives who are saying, no, do, but like my mom, to her credit in this moment, she's also an entrepreneur, says to me, "Great, you're going to finish a triathlon." I'm looking down, I can't walk, right? But there was, a long road to recovery over 18 months, learning how to walk again, eventually taking a job in Chicago in commodities trading and finance, using my education at least to begin my career in that, which didn't stick. And then, signing up for the Chicago Triathlon, and 18 months after I was burned in the fire, and 18 months after being told I would never walk again normally, this was back in 2008, I raced the Chicago Triathlon and not only finished the race, which was my goal, but I actually ended up winning the entire Chicago Triathlon, placing, first out of 5,000 people. And your question is like, when I get endurance, sure, at 5 as a swimmer, that was massive all the way through college. That was a big part of my life. But you're 21, 22 years old after college, this bad accident, and you think like, okay, like that's where doing sports like ends. Like, I didn't make the Olympics in swimming. I'm not Michael Phelps. Like, that's the end of the road. And all of a sudden I win this triathlon. And it was an interesting moment for me. It wasn't just like I pat myself on the back, like, well, I guess I'm just some world-class athlete. I'm amazing. Like, I'm great. Instead, it's like my mind goes back to that Thai hospital, wondering what would have happened had my mom not forced me to look towards that future and set this measurable goal, right? Like what would have happened otherwise? And furthermore, I've, in all my thinking about this over time, this was 16 years ago, like I realized that I fundamentally don't believe that I have something different than you or anyone else listening. I fundamentally believe that as humans, we all sit on these reservoirs of untapped potential to achieve really extraordinary things. But it fundamentally does come down to how do we react to inevitable setbacks?
Yeah.
How do we, pivot and evolve? That was such a sliding door moment for me. And had it not been from my mother, I probably would have just been like, yep, I'm never going to be the same again, kind of wallowed, probably bounced around for a couple of years, like aimless. And instead she focused me. I got on that. And then that has been, obviously led to triathlon, which led me to being a professional triathlete for 6 or 7 years, racing for the U.S. national team all over the world. And then now here I am 16 years later. It's, all these expeditions and world records and things.
Well, there's a lot in there, and there's also a lot in between that and now in those 16 years. And there are, I think, a lot of questions around mental fortitude, perspective, and given that we are all humans, how we condition that stuff. And I want to ask some of those things, but you hit on it. And I think that the curious question is, where did you land in terms of where you'd be if your mother wasn't there?
Yeah, I think that, of course, I have some intrinsic motivation within myself. But I think that in deep tragedy or, in massive setbacks, in this case, like all of a sudden not recognizing my own body, which is something I've been able to count on for so long. And, backing up for a second. So I have an economics degree from Yale. That's where I swam in college. All of my friends, it's Yale, 2006, economics degree. I come from like a low income background. Most of these kids are coming from prep schools and,
Sure.
Blue blood, situations. And everyone, 30% of my graduating class in 2006 went and worked on Wall Street. This is pre-credit crisis. This is, not to say that Wall Street's still not, booming, but it's like really like,
That was it.
yeah, like paved road to riches kind of scenario. And all those investment banks are recruiting kids, Yale economics degree. Do you want a job? Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, Lehman Brothers, you name it, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm not saying 30% of the economics majors, 30% of my entire graduating class, history majors, English majors, like they'll take anybody like at this point, let alone it's probably 97% of economics majors, which is what I was, were headed down that path. So when I raised my hand and I said, no, actually guys, I'm going to do my summer job painting houses. And then I'm going to take a surfboard and backpack and go like bum around like Australia and Fiji and like Thailand, like have fun with your like corporate ass jobs.
Yeah.
Like, there was a lot of pushback again from my peers, right? Like they were saying to me like, dude, you're missing it. Like, yeah, like it's going to be hard work in our early 20s, but like by the time we're this age, we're all going to have this much money. It's like a secured future in a lot of senses, right? And we all know from entrepreneurship, the numbers can be even higher, but it's far from a secure future. It's like, boom or bust, or try a bunch of things and fail and then finally figure something out or whatever. But anyways, me in saying that. So then I go down that path. And for a few months, I've got like all these epic, like they're at their offices in New York City, like grinding. And I'm like on the beach with like, some pretty girl in Fiji. I ended up meeting my, wife in Fiji on that trip and, various other like moments where like, I'm living it, like I'm living life. And I was like, my thesis was correct.
Yeah.
And then I burned myself in this fire. And it was this moment where not only was my own sort of, physical mind, body, spirit pretty crushed by the trauma, the actual physical trauma of the event. But it also, of course, brought up all those doubts of, see, I told you so. All my friends being like, oh, bro, not only did you miss the on-ramp to this lucrative career path, but you can't even walk. So like, you're like 10 times or 100 times or 1,000 times worse off than you would have been. You idiot, we told you do the thing that you should do in this moment, right? And so obviously the way life has turned out, I feel very, in fact, in a lot of ways, the burn accident was one of the greatest teachers and the resilience from that. But had I not had that guidance from my mother, right? I wonder, it's an open-ended question, but I certainly wouldn't have raced that triathlon. I certainly wouldn't have won the triathlon, become a professional triathlete. And if I hadn't done all those things, I most likely wouldn't have set 10 world records in endurance and expedition. So that would be drastically different. But moreover, if you go back to that acute moment, like what would have been the ripple effect in the other directions, the sliding doors? Like one, like, oh, use this as a growth moment. Massive setback leads to great learning leads to more resilience leads to all the things that have happened in my life, versus massive setback proves your doubters right. Those doubters have the last say. You start feeling negative about yourself, and then you kind of return to the world with the tail between your legs and some injured, banged up legs, and
doing heroin on the street corner.
Right. So, I mean, exactly.
I don't know,
It's interesting. And I think that, life really is that way, not just for tragedy, but it's an easy one to point to, which is, I believe that life is all dictated on how we react to things, right? The stories that we overlay on said experience and our own personal reactions to it, which is, there's, you can be a VC trying to invest in a business, right? And you go, why would I invest in this guy? He failed at his last business. Like, he failed at his last business. This guy's a loser. This guy is not going to get it right. There's a lot of VCs that had the opposite thesis, right? Mm-hmm. They would go like, I'm going to invest in this guy because this guy failed at his last business, but he's still charismatic, has a new ideas in front of me. This is a cogent, whatever philosophy of whatever business this is. Like, and I bet that dude learned so much from this experience, so much so that he's starting another experience and he can apply that failure, that setback to that.
And he's got a chip on his shoulder.
Got a chip on his shoulder.
And he's like, shit, I better figure it out this time. I'm so frustrated that it didn't work. I'm so wound up to prove myself that I'm going to make it happen.
Right.
Time.
And so those two profiles or avatars are talking about, like, that's really, if you really boil that down below the story of my business failed this, it's like, oh, your reaction to failure was either A or B, and those two things dictate so much. And that's true in the story that I just shared, as well as many other moments in my life, for sure.
Beyond a Million is brought to you by Easy Pay Direct. If you're an entrepreneur and you are still using a product like Stripe or PayPal to accept payments, it is time to find out why the largest names in your industry would never consider doing that. Check out easypaydirect.com/BAM to find out more.
So you go from professional triathlete to, professional adventurer, really.
Yeah.
And you have professional triathlete, despite it being equally or much more difficult than many other professional arenas in sports, it is not rewarded the same way, and it does not have the same fanfare that other professional sports do. So you can have a career in it, but certainly you're not getting obnoxiously wealthy like you would in the NBA or NFL.
No. It's like, I was happy to just have my expenses covered. It's more like sleeping on friends' couches, eating peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, trying to wrestle up enough money to, travel to the next corner of the world. I did, over those 5-6 years, race in 25 countries, 6 different continents. For me, like, the adventure was like, it's worth it as long as I could just just barely make ends meet. But it is absolutely not like, oh, and then I retired with my big house or whatever.
Right.
At some point you're like, okay, like, I'm just literally getting by. And again, that comes down to belief in process. For me, I was like, yeah, like, I get to push my body. I was super curious on the other side of the burn accident of like, oh, well, what are my limits then? Like, what are my physical limitations? How much more can I push my mind, body, and soul? And professional endurance sports was a great arena to do that. Like, quite literally racing against the best guys in the world week in and week out. And of course, training. And then also the adventure of the life experience of like going out there. And I say this to young entrepreneurs all the time, which is, one of my favorite groups of people to talk about, which is, sometimes people think, oh, if I don't take that well-trodden path, or I, leave to travel for a year, or I try this wacky. I find this mentor and he like wants me to work for him for a year. And I'm just like, yeah, because you're learning something. Like you're making yourself different in some unique way. And I always felt whether I was going to return to entrepreneurship, and I didn't know that I'd be a professional adventurer, in the early days of triathlon, but I had this belief of, even though I'm not making a lot of money right now, I am banking so many different life experiences, not just through the personal development and growth of pushing my body, but like I raced in Zimbabwe twice, in Estonia and Latvia, and places I wouldn't like ever go to, and exploring these cultures and interacting with all these things. It's like, I don't know exactly how those dots are going to connect moving forward. I love the Steve Jobs, quote, which is, you don't know the dots going forward, you can connect them going backwards. And it was this belief is like, every day I wake up and I have my bike in Mombasa, Kenya, and I'm riding it around. Like that's going to be something interesting in the future and how I apply it. And so that was always my sort of belief system in the process of those experiences cumulatively unlocking some sort of creative impulse, introducing me to some, interesting person or people. And I mean, that's true at scale, not just like one or two things. I mean, just like, all those things have stacked on each other.
Bro, that is a very insightful approach for a early 20-year-old person. Most people that go down that path do it fairly frivolously. And most entrepreneurs throughout their entire life have a hard time doing that, even in a silo, meaning they have a hard time saying, hey, I know that I want to learn business. I even know that I want to learn this industry, but I'm not willing to work for free. I'm not willing to just put the time in unaware of what the outcome might be, instead of the approach that you just said, which is, hey, I'm learning, I'm growing. I know that these experiences are going to contribute to the ultimate outcome on a long enough time horizon.
Yeah.
And most entrepreneurs fail to do that, much less humans. The next chapter for you is adventure, like real fucking crazy adventure, like things that nobody else in the world has done adventure. Tell me about I want the basics here, because I know you have an amazing book, The Impossible First, and I'm going to highlight that a little bit more when we get to that chapter of life. But some of these stories are in there. But the introduction into adventure initially, how did you pick? First off, what's the Explorers Grand Slam? Why did you pick it? And why on earth did you think this was the thing that you should be doing with your time, knowing that there's no paycheck associated? Like you're just like, hey, I'm going to carve out years to try to do this.
Yeah, it was an interesting moment. So I had been trying to make the Olympics in triathlon. That was like my stated goal. And it became clear to me not too long before the 2016 Rio Olympics. I was right on sort of the fringe of that, but it was looking less likely than likely. It was like right in the conversation, not like some random person, like right in the mix, but it was like kind of like, I might not quite get over the hump. And that is what it is. It was such a great part of my journey. So I started thinking like, what's next? Like, what do I really, deeply, deeply care about? And it was, right around the time, that I got engaged in 2014, and I was standing on top of a mountaintop where I got engaged with my, I guess, then fiance, Jenna, who you've met. And we're sitting there just kind of like thinking about life, like just thinking about like kind of the next chapter of life. It's an interesting inflection point, right? You're like making this commitment and you're like, so what do we want to do? What do we care about? What are our values? And similarly, I guess in a lot of ways of, my mother's visualization for me in that Thai hospital, what do you want to do when you get out of here? And I have now kind of coined this phrase that I call a possible mindset. I write about it in my book, The 12-Hour Walk. And I define that as a way, sort of unlocking limitless potential, in your own mind. Like, what could you do if there were no limitations, if you allowed yourself no limitations, essentially? And so it's like, okay, forget about money, realisticness of anything. Like, if I could do anything, like, what would it be? And as a kid, I'd always dreamed about climbing Mount Everest. I grew up in the Pacific Northwest, staring at Mount Hood, always loved the outdoors and loved mountains. And there was just this little boy inside of me that was always kind of like, I want to go to the Himalayas. I want to climb Mount Everest. I remember, reading John Krakauer's Into Thin Air in like the late 90s when I was in high school. And, just being, it's crazy because that's a book's about 8 people dying on Everest. But for whatever reason, that was like, I got to go there one day.
Yeah.
So that was really sort of just in my mind. And in the series of this conversation and sort of tapping into, like I said, this possible mindset, an empowered way of thinking that unlocks a life of limitless possibilities, I said to myself, man, I want to climb Everest. And right around that same time, I was aware of the 7 summits, which is the tallest mountain on each of the 7 continents, which of course includes Mount Everest. And then I'd heard about the even bigger layer of that, which is, well, then you throw in the North Pole and the South Pole, and that's known as the Explorer's Grand Slam. So I started researching this just out of curiosity, and I found out that only 50 people in history had ever completed the Explorer's Grand Slam. Now, my biggest, even though it's funny, I hadn't done a lot of climbing or mountaineering, and of course to climb Mount Everest, most people's initial hurdle in the mind would be like, well, shit, I better learn how to climb mountains, right?
Yes.
And that's obvious. But for me, with a growth mindset was something I've always applied with, even with the triathlons. I hadn't raced triathlon before, and then I won a triathlon. That gave me the confidence to go I can learn the thing. Will it take time? Do I need to practice it? Do I need to understand the skills? Absolutely. But there's no doubt in my mind that I am capable, and I believe honestly, we are all capable of saying, yeah, that skill over there, I've never rowed a boat. I want to learn how to row a boat. Oh, I've never run in a race before. Okay, I'm going to start jogging. We can learn, those things we can learn.
Yep.
But I was like, what's my actual biggest barrier to doing this? And this directly ties to entrepreneurship. I was like, I can't afford it. I've been a professional triathlete, just, hand to mouth, paycheck to paycheck. Everest by itself costs, now it costs well over $100,000. But at the time it was 50, 60K to do Everest. Who has just 60K rattling around to just go climb a mountain for a couple of months? Very few people, right?
Particularly if you're a professional triathlete.
Exactly. Right. In that phase of my life, I was in my late 20s, and was I have this dream. I believe I can actually do the thing, which is, a lot of people would be like, well, that seems the obvious barrier. Well, you can climb Everest, you never climb mountain. But it was no, that I've got.
Well, let me pause you on that for a second, because those are two different things, right? One is the capability of doing the activity, and the other is the fundraising, which, by the way, is just another activity that you may or may not have the capacity to do, right? Skill set to do. But in terms of capabilities, you gave us one data point of, hey, this one time I had never done a triathlon before, and then I won it. Was that enough, the one data point, or did you have other? I have a general narrative internally that is, as data points stack up, your confidence typically does, right? The more references you have to something, the more likely you are to be able to execute on that thing. But in negative situations, sometimes all it takes is one reference point that pulls you in the wrong direction.
Totally. I mean, it's the classic, you get 100 really positive Instagram comment. Oh, that's so cool. Great. I'm impressive, whatever. And one neggy comment, and you can only think the negative is such a higher compounding effect on our own psychology. No, there's no doubt about that. I think, honestly, there's been all sorts of data points and sort of subtle things that I can point to, over time, both that I was conscious of in that moment and, also unconscious of. When I look back as public school kid from Portland, Oregon, I ended up at Yale. Okay, that's against the odds, figured that out. When I got there and there was a bunch of prep school kids, and I was like, oh man, these kids are smarter than me. But I figured it out, how to get through that and navigate, that and ultimately, thrive, I would say. But it wasn't oh, I was born for this. This was my path in the world. And so I think that there's tons of examples, but there's enough examples of oh, I don't fit here. Oh, this isn't my, main thing, but let me figure it out, which I think is great. I mean, even in the painting example, it's we didn't know how to paint. Then we learned how to do it for a few months. And then pretty quickly we're oh, we don't have to keep doing this for somebody else. We can just do this ourselves. We have the confidence to walk up to someone and be we know how to paint houses now. And so I think when that growth mindset says I might not know this right now, but I can learn and grow towards that. And I think that is true for almost all things. And that we don't really have these innate set points, but it's easy in our mind to think differently. So that's the way that I applied that. But it is funny when I really even now think back into that moment when I was, dreaming up this Explorers Grand Slam 2014, 2015. I still, in this moment, when I bring myself back there, have this like high level of confidence of climbing the mountains. And it's not that I had a low level of confidence of the fundraising. I was like, man, that's going to be like hard work. And like, we'll see if we can like pull that off. But here was my strategy. And this, I know you guys talk a lot about sales, a lot about marketing, etc. My decision matrix went like this. I want to climb Mount Everest. And like, man, it would be really cool to like also go to the North and South Pole and like climb all these other mountains. Like that would be super cool. Like just as a life experience. Okay, hey, I want to do these things.
Yeah.
And then I thought to myself, well, what's standing in my way? Well, if you really budget out that project, not just Everest, but you add in all those other mountains, you're talking about like $500,000. Like I mean, yes, Everest by itself is crazy expensive, but those are like, you add those other things like, okay, now you're talking about like $500,000. I'm 28 years old, I don't have a trust fund. It's not like I'm sitting on like cash, like, and I've just been working a job that didn't pay me other than just like covering my expenses. So I've got like 10 grand maybe to my name, period, like saved up. So somebody else is going to have to fund this. Like that's like the only answer. And this is where most people stop. You're like, okay, cool. You want to do this thing, costs $500,000, but you don't have $500,000. Well, then you're not going to do the thing.
Yeah.
I thought the other way around. I thought to myself, okay, well, where's the opportunity here? If I were to just do this, like for fun over a course of several years, no one's going to care. Like there's no story in that. There's no marketing value in that. There's no product market fit, for lack of better things. However, if I can combine a couple things that I'm actually authentically passionate about into something, how can that actually have value enough in the market to equate to $500,000? So I said to myself, oh, well, setting the world record, being the fastest person in an elite way to actually do this Explorers Grand Slam, well, that all of a sudden elevates this project is wildly more interesting than, hey, can you give me money? Because I just feel like doing this thing, right?
Yeah.
And then in addition to that, and this is not just tacked on or inauthentic, and you and I have done some work with some schools. You know, you brought me into a charity here many years ago, which I loved working with in Austin.
Explore Austin,
exactly. Yeah. And those guys are amazing, and derivative of my work, which is passionate about like, hey, like I, as a kid, benefited from being in the outdoors, moving my body, and had wanted to start a nonprofit at the time around inspiring young people to get outside, move their bodies, and live active and healthy lives. So I was like, now there's like in the ether, Explorers Grand Slam, need $500,000. Better story if I do it as a world record. But if there's a charitable component, which is really something that's authentic to me, not tacked, when people tack that on, you can see right through it. But it's like, oh, that's actually something I want to do anyways. Great. Oh, this could be a force multiplier in creating that. So all of a sudden, we have like the beginnings of a business idea. But I'll share a story here because it's like, oh, maybe the answer is like, oh, and then it was just so easy. Well, it wasn't. Like, then we look at ourselves and go, what do we have? Not what we don't. We don't have 500K. We don't have a big Rolodex. We don't have experience. We have, and at the time it's Jen and I doing this together. We have no idea how to start a nonprofit. These are all things we don't have. Well, what do we have? Okay, we have 10 grand. Okay, it's not zero. It's not a lot. It's not 500K. We have 10 grand. So we can invest 10 grand in something in ourselves, right? And we have Google and the internet and like a couple of laptops, right? So there's a lot of answers that you can be found out there. How do you raise money? How do you start a 501c3 nonprofit? Oh, you need this form and that form and, all this bullshit to create, the government hoops to do that. We're learning. But we decide, we look at it and go, you want to raise 500K? You better look professional. You better have a cohesive idea, a name, a brand. This needs to look legitimate. And so we decide after all of our research that a best way to spend our entire life savings is on a website and a set of brand materials and assets. So that when somebody asks us about our Jen actually straight up looked at me. She goes, you want to raise $500,000? You better look like it. You better look the part. And to me, this comes back again, we're talking to entrepreneurs here. Like, this is why brand is important, right? This is why this is important. Our brains, if it's investors, if it's customers, if it's clients, we are seeing so many inputs in our digital world that if you don't look the part, or it's not professional, or there's no clear idea or thesis or value proposition, we pretty quickly just go like, okay, next, like we just move on, right?
Today more than ever.
Yeah. And so again, I really applaud Jenna for helping me sift through all that. And she was like, spend the 10 grand on a website. And so we went into a creative agency, which we had never been into before, which was, our first foray into that. And of course, they quote us like, oh, we can build this brand and this idea and this logo and the website, and whatever. It's $75,000.
Right.
And we're like, cool. So we have literally not one penny more than $10,000. But they looked at us with, a wink and a smile and the glitter in our eye and decided to help us out, essentially. So we built this amazing website. And we build like brand materials. It's funny because this dates the story, but we actually built like stuff that we printed out, like business cards with our logo on it. And we had like a little little 3-sheet little like pamphlet thing that we could like hand to people in meetings. We did all of that with no idea how we were going to raise the money. We spent all of our money on that. And then we thought to ourselves, great, now we can go do the thing. And what happened? Nothing. Crickets. We started emailing people, trying to set up meetings, having copies with like whomever the hell we could talk to, whatever. And this is what we heard over and over again. No, that's not going to work. You've never climbed mountains. What are you talking about? You have 300 Twitter followers. You're nobody. Like just all of the things as to why this didn't make any sense for any market value for.
Which by the way, are really logical responses.
Correct. So there was definitely a sinking moment. I remember this feeling that actually it still rings true for me. I was like, I said to Jenna right before we signed the deal with the creative agency, I was like, well, what if we build this website and do all this stuff and like no one wants to give us money for the project? And she just laughs at me. And I appreciate the lightheartedness of this because this was like our whole safety net.
Right.
And she laughs. She goes, well, at least we'll have a cool website. So fast forward, it's a couple months before I'm trying to leave to go do the Explorers Grand Slam. We've now put, 18 months of time of our full-time effort work into this. I was still racing triathlon enough to just keep the lights on, literally like pay my rent. But I was transitioning away from that. So I had a couple sponsors in that space that were still like, again, base level of my costs. So I was training, but basically this is what we were spending all of our time on. And the runway was running out of that. That was about to end. We had no other job signed up and I was supposed to leave in 2 months. And we were still like $400K short. I mean, we'd gone.
So what I'm hearing is that you have architected the whole plan logistically. You've said, hey, in order to do this, and in order to break the record, I have to leave on this date. Here's when I do this mountain, this mountain, this mountain, this mountain. The whole thing is framed out, but you have no money.
Correct. Like, and not only that, I'm not a big like act as if in terms of like, I don't believe you should lie to anybody. However, the only way you do the Explorers Grand Slam in world record time is to actually set up like all the permitting and logistics and have things in place. It's not just like, hey, on a whim, once I have the money, let me like organize that, right? And so yes, we had to do things in parallel, which is like try to raise the money, but also plan all of the things as if it is going to happen. And then this was the part where I definitely took pause in this moment, which is, and we started our nonprofit initiatives, which was amazing. At the time, Obama was president. We got actually, through a series of ways, actually invited to the White House to present for Michelle Obama's team, who was doing the big Let's Move campaign, which is a massive campaign around health and wellness. So that was like amazing. We're like, oh, we're getting some inroads there. And because of that, beginning to be able to invite it to schools to speak to young kids about health and wellness, but through the lens of this thing that I was about to do. And I remember this feeling, I was actually speaking in front of a room of like 3rd and 4th graders. And I was like, and in 2 months, I'm leaving. And first I'm going to start in Antarctica. Then I'm going to go to Nepal for Everest, whatever. In the back of my mind, I'm like, bro, like, I don't have enough money to get on like the first plane, let alone these things. Like, and am I lying to 10-year-olds? Like, that doesn't feel good. Right. But I wasn't lying. It was just the like, to your point, we had architected the entire thing. There was a date that we actually it's not like you could just, you can start it at random. Like, it has to start on a specific day because of weather and timing. It's a very, very specific thing. So I get invited by a friend of mine who's been sort of watching me try to raise this money. He goes, hey man, you should come to this spin class with me at 24 Hour Fitness. And I literally laughed out loud in his face. I was like, bro, this is my ego getting the better of me. I'm a professional athlete. You want me to go to he's like a Sunday spin class at 24 Hour Fitness? Like, hilarious. He goes, no. Like, honestly, man, like there's this woman there. I've met her a couple of times. She's super cool. Like, I just think you would like her. Like, she actually has set a world record. Like, you're trying to set a world record, you should meet. It's like, whatever. Like, and then he was like, honestly, man, like you should come. And I like laughed. I like literally laughed him in this conversation. But I woke up the next day and I was like, you know what? Like I am grasping at straws here with my ego get the better of me. Like I was willing to like meet anybody at this point. And at this point, I swear 1,000 people have said no to me. And so I go to the spin class and he goes, hey, Colin, meet Kathy Colin. And I was like, hi, Kathy, I'm Colin. And my friend Angelo, he says to me like, tell her about your world record. Like she has a world record. And she laughs it off. She's probably in her mid 50s, but she's super fit. She's like riding the spin bike already. The class hasn't even started, but she's like sweating. She's like, all right, definitely like hardcore getting after it. But she's like, she's like, oh my, yeah, she actually set the world record in the 5K, which is very impressive on the track. But she was like, oh my God, that was a million years ago. Like, Angelo, that's embarrassing to bring it up now. She's just like kind of like brushing it off. But she's like, well, what are you up to? I don't know anything about it. So I give her this like 30-second spiel, like just like, hey, doing the Explorers Grand Slam. This is why. This is my nonprofit initiative, whatever. I'm not pitching to her. I'm just literally like, giving her like spin class is about to start, 30-second, just boom. And she's like, oh, that's awesome. Good luck with that. And then I get on my spin bike and I start spinning. And I'm staying there. I'm like sweating in the spin class, being like, what am I doing here? Like, how did I end up here? where did I go wrong? And the class ends, and as you do in a spin class, you take your towels, you wipe the bikes down or like whatever from your sweat. And this woman, Kathy, she waves me back over and she goes, oh my God, I've been thinking about your project. Like, that is so cool. Like, I can't wait to root you on. Like, that's awesome. And she was like, well, you got to tell my husband about this. Like, he loves stuff like this too. And I was like, okay, yeah, great. And then she goes, oh, he's here actually. And she like waves over this guy. They hadn't been next to each other with their bikes. They were like separate in the class, doing their own thing, I guess, or maybe he arrived. I don't know. But like, they were not next to each other. So I hadn't met him when I walked in, and she waves this guy over. He walks over to me, and he introduces himself. Oh, hi, Mark Colin. Nice to meet you. And she goes, tell him the thing. Like, tell him the thing. Tell him the exact same thing you told me. And I was like, yeah, great. So 30-second spiel. Explorers Grand Slam. This is what it is. This is why I'm doing it. I'm excited about it. Kids' health. Blah blah blah. And he looks at me and he goes, interesting. He's like, that is amazing. Really cool. He's like, by any chance, are you looking for sponsors for this project? And my eyes like light up, obviously. I'm not thinking I'm pitching at all. I'm like, well, yeah, actually I am. We actually are looking for sponsors for this project. And he's like, great. The company I work at, I think could probably help you. And he goes, do you have a website or anything like that? And I was like, I sure do. I was like, where do you work? Where do you work? And he goes, oh, I work at Nike. And I'm like, oh my God, Nike. I mean, I'm in Portland working. That's like the dream of all dreams. Like, I obviously grew up in Portland, so the shadow of Nike, but that's on a global scale. If you're a professional athlete, that's like that's the one. And he goes, let me get you a card and you can email me that website on Monday and then we can have a conversation. I said, great. And so he shuffles through his gym bag. He pulls out his card. He hands it to me and I look down and it says, Mark Parker, CEO, Nike.
Crazy.
And I know, we spent a lot of time on this story, but the thing is yes, that changed my life. Yes, in the end, he saw the website. He invited me in. We had a meeting. Nike ends up sponsoring the project. Once they come on board, a couple other partners come on board. We just barely raised the money. I pull off the project. I set the world record. And, here we are now. But I tell that story to entrepreneurs for a specific reason, which is there's two interpretations of that story. Oh, wow, Colin, like you got lucky. Cool. You met the freaking CEO of Nike in a spin class at 24 Hour Fitness. Like, bravo. Like, awesome. That's one interpretation. And I think that's a cynical interpretation of the story. The point to me in my lived experience is that the 99 or the 999 other times that I failed where someone said, no, this isn't going to work, those were at bats. If I had been in that spin class on the first day of that, I didn't have a polished elevator pitch. In fact, when I didn't even think I was pitching, but it was refined. I actually had 30 seconds of passionate, cogent material to share. And I had invested my life savings into the website so that when that opportunity arose, I could actually do something with it, right? So for me, it's about failure, but it's like, I believe that failure plus perseverance equals success. And those 999 no's that I got before the one yes from Mark Parker were all just warm-ups or in the process of getting to that one yes. And yes, in business, more often than not, one person or one deal can really shift, the potential of your business or where you're headed. And so for me, it's a great lesson in the, resilience and perseverance, but also going like each one of these data points, each one of these lessons. Yeah, I pitched that guy, it didn't work out, but it doesn't mean it was a waste of time, right? My mom said to me since I was a kid, luck comes to those who are prepared. We were prepared in this moment, not just with the website, not just with this, but like when I went down and met with him in person, he's like, so when does this start? And I'm like, it starts on December 26th. It was like November 10th. He was like, oh, wow, this is like happening like next month. And he's like, well, walk me through the logistics. Not trying to poke holes, but I'm like, first I'm going here, and this is the flight. I have this deposit down here, blah, blah, blah. And he starts talking to me. He's like, oh man, like this guy has put in a couple of years of work to be ready for this moment so that this meeting, and if I write a check, he can go off and do it. Not well, I have this idea. If I get funding, maybe I could do this because I was sort of thinking this. It was like, no, I am doing this.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, it's kind of jump out of the plane and build the parachute on the way down type of mentality. But I have found that worked, and it certainly did in this instance for me.
There are a few big bullets out of that. For me, the last one was back to this idea of you need to be taking the action the whole time, whether or not the outcome is guaranteed. And if you're not doing that, you are doing yourself a disservice. The second was a sales note, which is not only had you done 1,000 reps on the pitch, I think potentially, I'm not going to say most importantly, because you cannot overstate the value of that repetition of refining the pitch. But in that moment, because you didn't know you were pitching, you also weren't loaded with a sales attitude, sales mentality. And the best salespeople in the world are not interpreted as salespeople, as trying to get the close. They are consultative salespeople, or like there's a sales model called the challenger model. And it's this idea of kind of the takeaway, right? If you're not really asking for the close and you're just kind of putting stuff out there, people lean into it. As the CEO did.
Yeah.
And then the third is this idea of, for me, the value of relationships. And so had you not had a social interaction with him, had you cold called him, you likely would have gotten a different outcome.
Totally.
So the question for me on this is today, how do you prioritize relationships? And how do you think about them in the scheme of adventure and professional life?
I mean, to me, it is the number one thing. And I think that's a really, I love that's a take home from this, because I know you and I for sure both share this in where we first met on 29 of 29, which is, a community of like-minded people doing an experience who also happen to be entrepreneurs and business people, whatever. But like, let's go have an experience together, build a relationship, and who knows what could come from that. I have really oriented my life more and more and more as I've continued to learn this lesson in twofold. One, you look at all the research on happiness, fulfillment, from the academics to anecdotally, like it really comes back to community. I mean, all of the research comes back to there's no culture, no time in the world, no whatever, when people have been like, oh yeah, people are super happy, like being in like deep, like isolation or like loneliness. In fact, it's the opposite. It's like, that's one of the highest comorbidities for early, depression, death, things like that. Like it's an epidemic. And in a connected digital world, people are actually more disconnected than ever from community. So forget business for 1 second. There's just a very strong case to be made for invest in community, invest in those that you love, and you're going to have a more deeper, more fulfilled life. But overlay that on business, it's massive. I mean, it is 100% like massive for me. One thing that has been interesting in the way that I have built my career over time, and certainly the story that I just shared sort of early in this phase of my career, 7, 8, 9 years ago, was a great lesson in that. But I have doubled, tripled, quadrupled down on this, which is I seek out opportunities that are win-win. One, I love having dope, incredible experiences around the world with like amazing people. Like I just like that because it's fun. I know like you did that Fiji trip a couple years ago, and if you're still doing that, or different experiences you have, like I just like doing that. So that's an easy yes for me.
Yeah.
But it's also not lost on me, to your point, like, in the past year, I went on a trip to Egypt for 10 days with a crew of 150 business people, entrepreneurs, super high level folks, billionaires, whatever, artists, creatives, highly curated like group of people. And I've been on a few trips like that in the last couple of years. One to Antarctica, one to Egypt, this past year to Tanzania. And in each one of those trips, I did not walk into that trip going like, oh, I look up the list of all the people. I mean, if I started listing the names, it's like the who's who, very, very, very impressive like list of people. And you can look at that list and you go like, oh, I'm going to make sure that on the third day that I'm going to sit down next to that guy. And like you said, like do the pitch of the thing that I want to raise the money for like the thing. And like, that could work. Maybe you have this opportunity to be in this room. But to your point, like, I don't know that that's the best way to go about it. And which actually is just more naturally occurring is to be like, man, I'm here. We're having a life experience. We are on hot air balloons over the pyramid with some of the most interesting people. I'm going to show up as my authentic self, have fun, create real relationships, have meaningful connections with human beings. Sure, they have impressive resumes and my resume is, maybe impressive, whatever. But like, let's just hang out human to human.
Yeah.
And then a year from now, 2 years from now, 5 years, whatever that is, there becomes an opportunity because now you're collaborating with your friends who happen to also be very, successful or able to help you, or vice versa, people that I can help with what they're building or creating. And it feels like a just genuine collaboration with the people you love. And it's extremely hard to get that level of trust or depth. And so I'm making a few different points here, but sometimes I think the entrepreneur sitting in the proverbial garage grinding on the computer feels like I need to button chair and work harder. And that's true. You got to put the time in. I put reps in every single day of the quote unquote work. But relationships are such a force multiplier to growth that investing the money and more importantly, the time to be like, oh, wow, I got invited to this trip to Fiji or Egypt or I don't know, somewhere nearby. It doesn't matter where the location, doesn't have to be an extravagant location. People go, oh, but I'm not going to get behind those emails. I'm not going to do that thing. And I'm like, just like, yeah, but you might meet somebody in that room that can 100x what you are doing. Mm-hmm. But if you go in there with that sales mentality on day one of like, oh, let me have a formal business meeting with you and sit across from you at a desk and try to talk about the thing. Like, yes, we got to do those meetings sometimes. I have to. But there's other times when you create natural relationships with people. And I have found pretty much my entire career has been mostly built on those actual real relationships. Yeah. And guess what? It's way more fun too, because now you're doing fun stuff with people that you actually know and care about and have been vulnerable with and have life experience with. It's win-win-win, I think.
Yeah. Where my head went with that was a lot of people think that the path to success through relationships is connecting with the right people. And another frame for that is that you don't build deep relationships with dope people by just meeting dope people. You build deep relationships with dope people by being a dope person, so that when you meet dope people, you might have something in common.
Yes.
You might connect.
Yeah.
Right? If you go and meet a world-class anything and you have not established yourself as a introspective, thoughtful person that's put in time, you meet that person and you are a fanboy.
Yeah.
Right? If you have put in a lot of time in something in your life, it doesn't even matter what it is, something, and you have shown that you are learning, growing, confident, that world-class person sees that. And you have some overlap, something to talk about.
Well, I love what you said. It can be in something because I had this funny. So actually, this is the opening story of my book, The 12-Hour Walk. It speaks directly to this, and it's a funny moment in my life because I make the mistake and I get pulled into this mistake of what you said. So I get invited. I'm speaking. I do a lot of public speaking, and I'm speaking for this big Wall Street conference. This is many years ago, kind of not early days of speaking, but on the beginning of that. I've been doing it a lot now, many years since then.
Before or after the Grand Slam?
It's after the Grand Slam, but before Antarctica.
Got it.
Yeah. I can't remember the exact date, but yeah, anyways. So, it's several years ago.
But we had mentioned that Antarctica becomes this pivot point. And so I want to jump there in a minute, but Antarctica becomes this pivot point of fame on some level because there was so much publicity. So Grand Slam, you're speaking, which means you don't have a ton of attention yet.
Yeah. So I get invited to this, I'm speaking for this big Wall Street event, the who's who of Wall Street, billionaire hedge fund guys. It's not just one bank. It's like many different hedge funds, and the biggest banks are like all like represented there. And then they invite me the night before to say like, hey, like, because you're one of the keynote speakers at this event, we want to invite you to this like little cocktail intimate like dinner. And I don't really know that much about it other than it's supposed to kind of be like the who's who of like whatever. And so I walk in and I'm in my like typical like black t-shirt, jeans, like Jordans. And, I look at the address. I'm in Manhattan and I go up and I like walk in and I'm in this like, ridiculously nice, apartment building. Right. And I walk up to the doorman. I'm like, hey, like I'm supposed to have this like thing at the penthouse. I'm like running a little bit behind. And the dude looks at me straight up and he goes like, oh, if you're with catering, like you need to use like the service elevator. And I'm like, oh, I think I'm like, a guest at the thing, like, whatever.
I'm the keynote speaker, bitch.
And the guy's like kind of like just like put off by like, me or whatever. But eventually he's like, oh, I guess you are. I'm like, okay, go up. And he puts me in the elevator. And it's one of those Manhattan buildings where like the penthouse doesn't go to like the hallway, it goes like directly into the apartment, right?
Yeah.
So you go up and you're like in the penthouse, just like opens up and this like ridiculous like,
and you didn't know it was happening probably. It just opens. You're like, oh shit, I'm in here.
Yeah, here we go. Like here we go. So I walk in and like every single person in this room is like, tailored suit, $100,000 watch, Rolex, Patek, the whole deal, like, just looking sharp and crisp. And like, here I am, like Jordan sneakers, t-shirt. And I'm like, oh man, I may have maybe I should have like thought about this, whatever. But I walk in with my, confident-ish enough self and start talking to people whenever. And then they invite us to dinner, and actually most of the people actually leave. There's like a cocktail hour with like 50 people or something like that. And then they pull us into a room and it's like 8 people for this like, dinner. So it's like, say goodbye to the dregs of their bit. And now I'm like sitting and I'm sitting at the head of this table.
Oh my God.
Like there's like place cards and like everything. And the host, this guy whose apartment it was, starts going like, oh, hey, like, I'd like we pretty much all know each other because we're competitors. We're, and they're all like, good old boys club. The average age in this room is like 70 years old, all white dudes, like all like, classic, out of a Wall Street, like, kind of movie or something like that. And they all start, introducing themselves, and it's just one after the next. I'm not going to say the names, but it is literally like the who's who, this $1 billion hedge fund, that $1 billion hedge fund, this sovereign wealth fund. I mean, just like the who's who of, Wall Street. And then it comes around to me last. And I'm thinking to myself, this is why I brought this story, because I'm thinking to myself, like, man, what am I going to say in this room? They're all like, oh, my take on macroeconomic policy is this and that and blah, blah, blah. And this money, $100 trillion of this GDP is going to move from here to there. Like I make these big claims and now it's me. And they're looking at me, dude in a t-shirt. No, to your point, like not as established, with my notoriety at this point in my career. And I'm like, yeah, so, I'm Colin, and I have an economics degree from Yale. I actually worked on Wall Street as a commodities trader for like 10 months. Like I'm trying to speak their language back to them, which is laughable because it's like these guys are like the most fucking credible in this, and like they don't need to hear about some kid who randomly fucking traded commodities, like whatever. And thank God the host steps in, and he's like, no, Colin, like tell him about the thing. And I'm like, what? And he's like, and he literally goes, do you guys know who you're sitting with right now? Like, this is Colin O'Brady. And he starts being like, he just climbed Everest, he just did the Explorers Grand Slam. He set this world and that world record. And, he's like going through this. And all of a sudden and I'm like, yeah, that's all true. Great. And I'm thinking like, now we're going back to like the regularly scheduled
Now let's talk
program of,
about
like,
economics.
economic policy or whatever. And these guys all stop and look at me
Right.
and are like, oh God, we're sick of fucking talking about,
Yes.
moving. Like, let's talk about this. Let's talk about adventure. Let's whatever. And we end up having this very engaging conversation. And I end up being sort of the core focus of the entire, they want to know everything about Everest. Oh, you've seen dead bodies up there. Have you this? Have you that? Whatever. And the closing of this story in the book, the 12-hour walk, is I had gotten this point asking people this question. So what's your Everest? Because the story for me was like, I was a kid and I was like dreaming about being, climbing Everest. And so I had this dream inside of me. And I asked like school kids this question all the time. But in this room of people sort of so engaged with it, I was like, said to them, I was like, so what's like, I would love to know, like, is this what you guys always dreamed? What was your, like, what were you like when you were 10, 15, 15 years old growing up? And these super charismatic, really, obviously impressive group of people, it just goes crickets like in the room. It just goes like silent. And like kind of people are sort of looking around and like no one answers. And it's kind of like an awkward pause until somebody like cracks some joke and takes the conversation in a different direction, but no one answers the question. And I was like, oh, that was weird. Did I say the wrong thing? Whatever. So I'm walking out of the room that night, after dessert and all this sort of stuff. And I'm getting back in this, elevator to go down from the penthouse and, go back to my hotel room or whatever. And this guy pulls me aside. He's probably, like I said, the average age is probably like, 70 years old, but this guy's probably looked like he was 80. He's like an older guy in the room, pulls me aside and he just says, hey, like, I just wanted to apologize for my friends earlier tonight. And I was like, oh, there's nothing to apologize about. And he goes, no, you asked a very important question. And none of us had a good answer to it. And he looks at me and he says, I have made more money than you can possibly ever imagine. And he goes, but there's this summer camp that I went to when I was 14 in upstate New York. And I have this moment in my mind of being on this rowboat and the stillness and the calm of that and being in nature. And there's not a day that goes by that I don't go back in my life and wonder, did I miss it? Did I spend too much time in these boardrooms thinking about finance and whatever? And he just throws that as sort of like this open-ended question as an old man reflecting on his life. And then he kisses me, he goes, promise me this, like, keep doing what you're doing. Keep asking yourself that question. What's your next Everest? What are you actually passionate about? What lights you up? There's no right answer other than actually listening to that. And he's like, and now I wish I had asked myself that question a few more times throughout my own life. And it in the moment, I mean, he was tearing up, and it was an emotional conversation that he was sharing this with me, and it stuck with me. Hence why I opened my book with that story, because here I am sitting in a room of people who are quite literally the pinnacle of what most would consider the highest level of success, certainly financially. And still, as this guy's reflecting on his life, he's going like, where did I go wrong? What could have been different? Where could I have been more deeply fulfilled? And it wasn't a lesson about money is the root of all evil. It wasn't that. It was just like, what do you really care about? Like, how can you monetize that or make that fun? But I think entrepreneurship is born from that, to bring this all the way back to this conversation, is the best entrepreneurs that I know a lot of wildly successful entrepreneurs, weren't only thinking about their exit one day. They were actually like, yeah, I'm going to get rich doing this thing and that's fun and I could have this big exit. But it's because I authentically actually want to climb this Everest day in and day out. Even when it's hard, I'm going to get up like, this is interesting. This is creative. I'm solving this problem. I met this person. I'm flying here. I'm going there. Like the process of doing. It wasn't a mortgaging the present for the future kind of scenario.
Yeah.
And that's what I took from that conversation with that guy. But to your point, where this all started is, it's not when you meet a bunch of interesting people, it's about network. You're talking about networking or just getting to know other people. It's not actually saying, can I be a mirror of you? No. In fact, by doing that, you end up in a competitive space with that person. You have actually less likely to connect with them some of the time, because now you guys are too close in comparison.
Yeah.
But it's the inflection of, I'm sitting in a room of hedge fund, high net worth, guys who have been wildly successful. And I'm interested because I'm not necessarily interested in the crazy opulence, but I'm like, wow, like something inside of you got you to this place, which means you are driven in this. And they're looking at me going, that's hilarious that you said you have an economics degree from Yale, but you don't know anything about our world, but you know about a world, Colin, that we don't have any experience in. But what's the essence? It's passion, drive, grit, perseverance, risk, assessing risk, pushing through when it's hard, whatever. And there's that commonality. And so to your point, when you meet other really dynamic, interesting people, it's not, let me be a mirror of your exact same dynamism. It's like, oh, I see that thing in you, but I can also learn from you. We can create together. We can hang out. We can have discussions, not about like, the intricacies of payments or whatever, the niche thing that you know super well, but about like passion, creativity, entrepreneurship, scale, all the things that I just said. I mean, that is what I think is the juice.
Yeah. And I think that there is frequently an area in the Venn diagram, right, where you overlap. And so, and you just highlighted what some of those things are. What I think people fail to recognize is this is true for many, many, many people, but specifically for the elite, for the high performers in any space, they are far less interested in what they already know. What engages those people, excites those people, intrigues those people are the areas that they don't know how to perform well in.
Totally.
That's what impresses them, right? To the elite, it's the things that they can't do well or haven't done well. Not can't, but haven't done well. That's what's interesting. Oh shit. Not only do you do this thing, but you do it at that level? What the fuck? Right? And so I think that for people that are spending time on whatever they're spending time on, that's the ticket. And some people look at that as authenticity, being true to yourself. To me, I think one of the most difficult things in life to find is this perpetual North Star to guide you. And if you are one of the few that has found it, you're lucky, right? Applause to you. But in the meantime, fucking work until you find it. Because through that work, you learn, you grow, you become more dynamic, you become a better person. And that allows you to continue to level up and meet other people that can help you through that journey.
Totally. And I think that's incredibly well said. And I do ask that question to people, what's your Everest? And some people have great answers to your point. Oh, I'm lit up about this, right? Always dreamed about this, or I'm passionate about this. And maybe they say, but I haven't gotten there because there's some limiting belief of why they haven't gone towards it, but they actually know what it is. But there is a lot of people, to your point, that go, the way they ask the question back to me when I ask the question is, what if I don't know what my Everest is, right? Mm-hmm. Which is to say, like, I want that purpose drive, but I'm sitting here in stillness of like waiting it to like, hit me over the head.
Right.
And it is by taking intentional, the answer, I believe, is not like, I don't know, sit there for a while, you might figure it out. It's like, try stuff, like mix it up, like take that job, take that risk, try something different. It might be the wrong thing, but guess what? When you start thinking like, I don't like that, is actually a powerful way to get closer towards what you do like or what you are passionate about, right? We don't know love without heartbreak, right? We don't know pleasure without pain, which means like you're not going to know what your Everest is or what your North Star is without also knowing what your North Star isn't, right? Yeah. And so it is by doing that we unlock and discover some of that.
I totally agree. And I'm going to pull this back to endurance because we would be remiss to not talk about your, a couple of these fucking ridiculous, more recent things that you've done. Frequently, you don't know what you don't like until you give it enough time to figure it out. And so in endurance, I've done a little bit of endurance stuff, baby stuff next to Colin O'Brady.
I met this guy. I have an event called 2929 where you climb the vertical feet of Mount Everest from sea level. And it is a crazy hard challenge for 99.9% of the people. But Brad shows up on day one. He goes, Everest? I mean, that seems pretty cool. But do you think in the same 36 hours that you guys are going to climb Mount Everest, the equivalent of Mount Everest, 29,000 vertical feet? In case you're wondering, that is a ton of vertical feet. Like 50% of the people don't finish even after 36 hours nonstop. Brad looks at us and goes, I'm going to do it twice. I'm going for double Everest, but in the same amount of time. And we all looked at him like, yeah, cool. Guy with the mohawk wants to do some crazy thing. Respect. And he was raising a bunch of money for charity too, which was awesome. However, he, sure enough, 36 hours nonstop, I think break down to the minute practically.
Yeah, pretty much.
Managed to climb 34 laps of Stratton, Vermont, which is insane. And that was our first inaugural event back in 2017. We've hosted dozens and dozens of them. The business is thriving. We have 7 events per year. And still to this day, nobody has come even remotely close to trying to double up. In fact, someone did try it last year at Utah. And after it's 11 laps at Utah. And after the 12th or 13th, they were like, bro, this is insane. I'm good. Stop. Take my red hat and go home. When Brad says he does a little endurance things, he's being modest.
I appreciate that. That was an experience. And I love that you guys put it on and do it. And there's there are tons of stories in that and lessons in that for me. And one of them is in any endurance event, I refer to it as the inevitable suck. It's not a question of maybe a fraction of 1% of the time you do an endurance event and somehow you fly through it and it doesn't suck.
Pretty rare.
Pretty fucking rare. Yeah, right. Pretty fucking rare if ever. And it's usually some long training run that just so happens nothing went wrong, right? But usually you have to live in that space of shittiness for at least a little bit and usually a long time. To frame your, and I think there are a lot of things you can get out of this, but to frame Antarctica, your journey across Antarctica, a marathon for normal humans is usually somewhere between 3 and 5 hours. Ironman races get cut off at 16 hours. Antarctica, you are going for how many hours a day roughly?
12 hours a day.
12 hours a day for 54 days straight. And I want it and it's 932 miles.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to highlight the intensity of that for people because the first question, and I imagine you get this too, for people that hear that you do endurance stuff, is they say, have you done an Ironman? And I'm like, motherfucker. And no, I haven't. And I'm like, shit, I should do one just so I can answer that question. Yeah. Right. But an Ironman is not anywhere near the pinnacle of endurance athletics, right? It is the one that I think, and by the way, it's still a fucking significant thing, specifically if you race it, as opposed to just aim to complete it. But it's a lot of time, 12 hours straight to be pushing and then to do it repeatedly day after day after day. I look at endurance stuff. When people say, how do you do those things? I look at it and say, there are 3 things. There's the physical training component, and people think that that's the hard part. There's the mental side of it. And then there's the nutrition side of it. Mm-hmm. If you agree with those 3 things anyway, which of those is the hardest thing for you?
So the mental component, the physical component, or the nutrition component?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they're all definitely interconnected for sure. I think without a doubt, the most important of those 3 is the mental component. I mean, there's really, to me, there's no even close comparison to the other 2. I feel like when I look at the sort of pyramid of those 2 things as it relates to endurance, the physical and the nutrition component are table stakes, which means you can't run a marathon or walk across Antarctica if you don't have sufficient calories to fuel your body. Like if, our bodies can hold 90 minutes of glycogen, essentially sugar. You can be a Kenyan marathoner running 450 marathon pace. If you get to 90 minutes, if you haven't eaten anything, your body's going to essentially shut down. You're going to be running 10-minute mile pace. That's just the physiology of the body. So nutrition, super important as a baseline to get right. And I have spent a lot of time refining that to get as perfect as possible and optimized. Physical component, similarly, you can't pull, as I did, a 375-pound sled alone across Antarctica for 54 days if you've never, been to the gym ever. It's just, you have to have some level of, work that you have put in to get to all of that. But the other 2 matter 0 Doesn't matter how peak of condition you are in or how well your nutrition is if you don't have the mindset to get there. And I will share it in the opposite direction, which is I have seen people overcome their physical limitations with the mindset. We'll talk about Antarctica specifically, but because we were just talking about 29 out of 29, it comes to mind real quick, which is 29 out of 29, our business, 29 out of 29 Everesting. Fun business. We love it. It's all about community, inviting people to do this, incredible challenge. You've been there a couple of times. We love having you out there. What's amazing is that we have had Olympians and Ironman and, world-class athletes do our event. And it's not a race, but no one's really been able to finish it faster than about 15 or so hours. Which is still like the maximum time as an Ironman. And that's the fastest people who have ever done it, essentially, right? But 36 hours is our cutoff. And what's more interesting to me is that we have had numerous people show up having never done a 5K, having never done an endurance event, not owning the identity of I'm an endurance athlete and I've already done this ultra and this Ironman, that Ironman. They were like, I heard about this. It sounded interesting. Because it's hiking uphill, you don't need a skill acquisition you don't need a bike, you don't need equipment, you don't need to know how to do a skill. Most people can walk uphill, at least for some period of time. So we have had people show up, and at first we were like, oh my God, these people, maybe they should do something else first. I have seen those people time and again, middle-aged women in their 50s, never done a 5K, finish 29 on 29 Everesting. And why? To your question, is they showed up. Yes, they did some training ahead of time, but they showed up with the mentality of, I'm willing to try this. And I think if I stay out here for 36 hours nonstop and I don't sleep and I keep moving, I might actually be able to finish this. And that 100%, I've watched it over and again, is the power of the human spirit and what we have inside of ourselves when we set our mind to something and have that focused mindset on a problem. And that, for me, has certainly made all the difference in Antarctica and other realms of my life for sure.
Fuck yeah. I love that. I get, this is the problem with having conversations with you is then I want to go do shit. And the reason that I got to 29 out of 29 in the first place is because I was listening to Jesse Itzler speak on stage and I was drinking tequila in the back of the room and I had a visceral response to him talking about this idea, which at that point you guys had never done before, the 29 out of 29 event. And I was like, I think I literally said, fuck. And people looked at me and I just knew I had to go do this thing. And so I hear you talking about it and I'm like, shit, I want to go do something. But it begs the question, it is easy to give up in general. It is easier to give up when something significant happens that indicates that you should give up. A physical injury, nutrition deficiency, you bonk, you hit a wall, not literally, but physiologically. How do you, in those moments when you realize this is highly improbable right now, or borderline stupid to keep going, in the moment, how do you make sure that you as an athlete, as a competitor, as Colin, keep going?
Yeah, I know we don't have a ton more time left, but I will share. To me, it's interesting. A couple of things come up when you ask me that question. One is, I think we have this belief inside of us that things are. We sort of have a bias towards something being linear, which means if it's bad, if it was good and then it's getting bad in the middle of an endurance event, it can only possibly get worse, right? That's where our mind goes. It's like, I started the marathon out and my feet weren't sore. And then 10 miles in, my feet were pretty sore. And then 20 miles in, my knees were screaming. So at the finish line, I'm going to be able to not be able to walk, right? That's and again, that's a logical thought process. It turns out it doesn't really work that way. And you know this from doing enough endurance events, which is it's actually not linear, particularly if you can convince yourself in those hard moments to keep going. So from Antarctica, I'll share a very brief, very concise version of this story. I get dropped off in Antarctica. It's 2018. I'm attempting to be the world's first person in the history to cross the entire continent of Antarctica, the landmass solo, unsupported, which means no resupplies of food or fuel, and unaided. So no kites, no dogs, no nothing else that's going to propel me. Just me, mano a mano, trying to cross the frozen continent alone. And, I've trained for it. I'm like, think I'm prepared. I just had this big break in the press where like the New York Times wants to like feature it. It's like this like big like front, it's the biggest piece of press I'd ever gotten to that point in my career. Right as something, he's Colin O'Brady is going to attempt to do this thing, like, whatever. And I get down there and I load up my sled. The plane drops me off, takes off. So I'm alone in Antarctica and I'm like, okay, here it is. I'm going to start beginning. And I try to pull my sled and I straight up can't pull it. Like I can move it like 10 feet. Like I'm like, and like pull it like 10 steps and like stops. It's 375 pounds. I know it's the heaviest it's going to be at the beginning because I'm trying to have just enough food in there to survive to the other side. And so each day it's going to get a little bit lighter, but I can't move it on the first day. And I've already taken everything out of that sled that I can possibly think to take out of it. And the reason people had failed time and time again, including someone who had died a few years earlier, just 100 miles from the finish, is that the math equation didn't work. Like if you took, to your point about nutrition, too little food, some point, 40, 50 days, your body shuts down and you can no longer move. And that's a very compromised place to be in Antarctica. But if you take too much, you're me at the start line, not being able to move my sled at all. And I break down and I start crying in that moment. I actually called my wife back on the sat phone and I'm crying and the tears are freezing to my face. I'm like, what do I do? And she says to me, you can see thematically here, I've had some great wisdom from the strong women in my life. And she was like, forget about the nearly 1,000 miles you have to go. Like, forget about how far it is or if you're going to make it. Get through today. Get through this moment. And she knows that I have these waypoints marked on my GPS. Like, get to the first waypoint. Just get to the first waypoint. There's 1,000 more miles to go. But today, take an incremental step to getting there. And that really did reorient my mind in that moment. I was like, fine, whatever. Like I start doing the math of the thought. I'm like, I went a half a mile today. Like this is never gonna work. And I just did this article in New York Times, like how embarrassing. She's like, forget about that. And it's the same for you. You're talking about an endurance event, you're bonking or you're having a tough moment or you're in the middle of an entrepreneurial push and you're just like getting smacked in the face. A bunch of things have gone wrong. Like those are the moments where it's like, man, like I should just throw my hands up and quit. Like I'm done here. Like I should just quit. But if you can find it in the middle of an endurance event, or for me alone in Antarctica to be like, okay, like I did get to the first waypoint today. Can I get to the next one tomorrow? Like it's only 4 miles from here. Yeah. Yes, 930 more to go, but like, can you go 4 more today? Yeah. 4 more becomes 5. 5 more becomes 6. And fast forward on my 53rd day alone in Antarctica, when I'm nearly completely out of food, my body is beat up. I've got the beginnings of frostbite across my face. I mean, you've seen the pictures. Like I'm a skeleton. I'm a shell of a human at this point because I've been out there pulling my sled 12 hours every single day. I end up getting this deep surge of energy inside of my body, inside my mind, inside of my spirit. And I actually end up pulling my sled 33 hours, nonstop, 77 miles in one continuous push to complete the crossing, become the world's first person to cross Antarctica. And I share that because, again, it's not linear. Yes, my sled was lighter at the end, but my body was ravaged. I've been alone in Antarctica for 50 some days. But on day 1, I'm crying, tears frozen to my face, and I can barely move my sled, wanting to quit and give up. But somehow I found it in myself not to give up. And on the day when it should seem the day when I'm stumbling and can't walk and can't move, my body's broken down. That's what like logic would tell you. I actually perform at my absolute best because the process of going through the difficulty and the challenge and overcoming all the incremental setbacks along the way actually forged an even stronger version of myself than actually existed in that preliminary part of that. And so for me, it's always a reminder. I said it before, failure plus perseverance equals success. Another thing I'm fond of saying, and it goes back to that Mark Parker story of the Nike CEO, I say winners lose the most. Winners lose the most. It's those reps, it's those incremental failures, it's those setbacks along the way that eventually do lead to that. But it only leads to that in that equation if you take the incremental failures or the moments in endurance when you're feeling bad and you add the ingredient of perseverance, a way of saying, you know what? I'm going to go one step further. I'm going to make it to one more waypoint. I'm going to send one more email. I'm going to pick up the phone and call one more, try to close one more sale. And you just chip away of that. And then it doesn't get worse. The knees don't hurt more. And we've seen people almost every marathon who couldn't walk at mile 20 go to the end of the New York City Marathon. People even finishing 5 hours, 6 hours, back of the Packers, they sprint across the finish line 9 times out of 10. Because there is more inside of you, and it's not a linear, decrease of your power. There is actually way more power that lives inside of us if we can keep moving forward.
I love that. Okay, so I want to highlight a couple things because I know we're coming up on time, but you wrote a book about that experience, The Impossible First. I have a lot of friends that write books, and most of them are trash. Said a nicer way and less for effect. They're either not well written or not super impactful, and they're written for the purpose of being a business card or trying to amplify whatever they're doing. The Impossible First is a really epic journey that we've touched on a couple points of that here, but it's also written incredibly well. And if you listen to it, you read it. Mm-hmm. So you get to hear the stories from your perspective, which is, in this case, in some cases it's irrelevant. In this case, really adds a ton to it. So the audiobook is great. One of the things that I like to ask adventurers, and it seems to be a contentious point for some, is it more about the adventure and the experience of the adventure or the story?
Yeah, it's a great question. Not contentious at all. I think it's both. I think it really is both. And I think that having those things in balance at both, I think, will create the most impact. For me, of course, first and foremost, it's about the experience. And I have one simple question that I ask myself before any one of my expeditions, any one of my big adventures, is my litmus test is very, very clear. If I could tell nobody about this, would I still want to do it? And the second I answer no to that question, then it's off the books. I'm not doing that expedition. Just not interested. So that's like my first anchor point. But if I answer the question, yes, I would walk across Antarctica for 54 days if I could tell nobody about it. I can tell you that 100% because for me, I'm just a curious person. I had a deep curiosity. What will happen to my mind, my body, my spirit, success or failure? If I'm alone for that long, we don't spend time alone, let alone in a place that's minus 40 degrees with the wind blowing, where every decision you make is of the highest, stakes. Yeah, I'm down for that. However, beyond that, about the question about the story is, one, yes, I certainly believe we are the stories that we tell ourselves. But the reason we're having this conversation via podcast, the reason I've been inspired by so many podcasts, I'm an avid reader by so many books. I mentioned a book, John Krakauer's Into Thin Air that he wrote in 1996 that, changed the trajectory of my life. We have the ability to ripple out into the world and impact and inspire one another. And so for me, not from an ego, hey, read my book, don't read anyone else's book, type of that's not the point. It's to say hey, I think that we all have a responsibility, whether you're famous, not famous, rich, not poor, around a dinner table in a stadium full of 10,000 people on a stage. When we share stories with one another, we have the ability to inspire, impact positively, have an effect on those around us. And I think that is a really beautiful part of the human experience. And so, for me, it's, certainly the business fundamentals of that have been aligned in that I get to do the things that I love to do. And by sharing those things, I've created a number of very lucrative business, models for myself. Great, but more than anything, it's a win-win-win, which is we have the ability to inspire each other and have that ripple effect of positivity roll out into the world. And then I think that bounces off. There's people that have been oh my God, you inspired me and I did this. And they tell me their story and they'll tell me a story. And now I'm super inspired to go do the next thing and that. And it's oh, we're both giving each other plus energy and uplifting each other. And I love that.
I do too. And I think that I would like to challenge anybody from an entrepreneurial perspective to think about the things that you've done well and that you're good at, and think about how to package those and communicate them to people in your life, because it will inspire them. It is likely. And it's specifically the things that you are so good at or you do so often that you think they're mundane. And so many people don't know how to do it, can't hold themselves accountable, don't have the discipline or the experience or the reps. And so hearing the story is enough to inspire. The other thing that you hit on, and I'm going to say it a different way, is you talked about the ripple effect and going back and forth. Said another way, stories of your experience are a phenomenal opportunity to connect and build relationships with people. And when I think about why my driver for a lot of things, ultimately, it's the depth of relationships. One last question for you, and hopefully we can carve out time another time because I've got 1,000 others. But the one that inevitably you have to get all the time is you have 10 world records. You've done these death-defying, we didn't even get into your near-death experience as of late in your most recent expedition, death-defying experiences. Succinctly, why do you keep doing all this crazy shit?
For me, it is, like I said, I think the word curiosity, continues to bubble up inside of me. And that's, yes, we've talked a lot about the expeditions, and those are some of the most rich stories, of course. But to me, it's across all different spectrums, like the curiosity, not always just of high performance, but of trying new things that I've never done before. I appreciate your kind words about my book. And I've written 2 books now, but before I wrote the first book, The Impossible First, I was like, I've never written a book before. And I was like, what's the best, accolade of writing a book? Okay, a New York Times bestseller. And I was like, great. I want to become a New York Times bestseller. Not because the ego of that, but it allows me to have a focus on okay, then if you want to do that at that level, well, then what is that required? Oh, I got to learn how to write super well. I need to learn how to craft story. I need to understand the publishing industry. I need to understand all this stuff. That's just my curiosity going that goal, which is somewhat of an arbitrary goal. And I'm very, pleased to say that I did reach that goal, which is out of every 1 million books written, it's 10 books out of 1 million become New York Times bestsellers. It's a very small percentage. But that's not the point. The point is the why question. Is the curiosity to continue to peel back the onions on the human experience, and having the goal. I want to walk across Antarctica. It's not so I can beat my chest afterwards. It's actually in the process of throwing the goal out there. Great. If I'm going to write a book, I want to write a New York Times bestseller. Well, okay, then that opens up a series of 10,000 other questions and people I get to interact with the course of that, of just learning, of curiosity. And so as I approach other things, yes, other expeditions, I recently became a father. My son is 7 months old. That's its own, adventure, a lifelong adventure in itself. Publishing, stuff I do in Hollywood, other businesses, whatever. Those are all formed from the place of a curiosity of, sucking the juice, out of life. Of really asking yourself, what can we experience on this one precious ride and through life? And these goals, so to speak, that they look very this very specific linear goal, are actually just carrots for me to throw in front of myself to be able to continue to explore. I love to say the top of one mountain is really just the bottom of the next. And I don't say that in the hamster wheel of achievement of I gotta get the next thing and the next accolade, but actually of deriving purpose through life and a little bit of direction, loose direction, to give yourself a life of context, or give yourself a context to sort of pursue things in life. And for me, my most meaningful experiences come from having, sort of created that context throughout my life.
The Impossible First, a must read. 12-Hour Walk is the most recent one, and probably more accessible to a lot of humanity. Colin O'Brady, where else do you want to point people if they want to find out more about you or whatever you're interested in right now?
Yeah, come say hi on Instagram or social media at Colin O'Brady. Of course, my website, just my name, Colin O'Brady, speaking, any of that kind of stuff. But we didn't get to talk about it a lot, but definitely check out the 12-Hour Walk. It is Yes, it's a book. It's live and full of adventure. It's a fast and fun read, but it really is prescriptive in the sense that it's talking about how we can all overcome these limiting beliefs and really strengthen our mindset through a very, very single, succinct one call to action, which is an invitation for people to turn their phone off for a day, walk out their front door, and take a 12-hour walk alone. Can be in your neighborhood, can be in a trail somewhere. It doesn't matter. And it also doesn't matter how many breaks you take. This is not a race. This is not how far you can go in 12 hours, but it is actually a pattern reset. Because ask yourself, when is the last time that I actually spent 12 hours alone by yourself? And you might be an entrepreneur thinking, I don't have the time for that. Well, there's a chapter in the book that's about that limiting belief, but I will say this. You don't not have the time for that. I will tell you right now, tens of thousands, if not more than that, have done that, the walk all around the world. People do it every single day. There's an app that supports it, tracks the app, etc. We've had people in 40, 50 countries, every continent do the 12-hour walk. But here's the thing. Taking a day alone in your thoughts, the amount of people come back from the walk, they send me videos, they're crying, they're cracked open, they have 50 pages in their journals written because of the creativity that unlocks. And even though your task list seems endless right now, I got to do this, I got to send this email, I got to be here, I got to be this meeting, I got to whatever. Yes, you need to do all those things to do what you're pursuing right now, but there is so much value in this simple prescription, which is free at your front door, is stop. Stop for a second. Look inwards, listen to your internal dialogue of what's going on. So the 12-hour walk book is about that, but its essence, it's an invitation. You don't have to read the book. Turn your phone off, turn your podcast off. Sorry, Brad, not this one walk. And take 12 hours to walk alone in silence. And there is so much to be gained. I've seen it happen at massive scale all across the world for people taking that moment to look inward. You can learn more at the12hourwalk.com.
I love it. Sometimes at my busiest, I am challenged to remember that the most productive thing I can do is nothing. Colin O'Brady, I appreciate you coming out, man. It's always good to see you.
Always a pleasure, my friend. Thanks for having me.
Love it. I hope you enjoyed the episode as much as I enjoyed doing it. I need your help. There are 3 places you can find Beyond a Million. The podcast itself, beyondamillion.com, which has some cool free resources, including a free course. And we finally launched the Beyond a Million YouTube channel. I would love it if you would go there and subscribe. And if you don't want to, you still would probably enjoy seeing the visual content. Check it out, youtube.com/@Beyond a Million.